Hi, thanks for joining me. My name is Mindy Mandell, and as you can see, today's video is on Book 11 of the Laws. Now, we're almost through the Laws now. There are 12 books total. So at this point, what Plato is ready to do is start putting things together and giving us a better picture of the state of mind of someone who has been educating the soul in the way that he's been talking about through the virtues. And so we're going to start with something that he calls treasure, but we're going to see very quickly that what he's really talking about here is the state of mind of justice. And all of the translations that I've been using throughout the laws are from Robert Gregg Bury. Okay. As the first of such things, let us mention treasure. That which a person has laid by in store for himself and his family, he not being one of my parents, I must never pray to the gods to find, nor if I do find it, may I move it. Okay, so don't take what's not yours. For never should I gain so much pecuniary profit by its removal as I should win increase in virtue of soul and in justice by not removing it. And preferring to gain justice in my soul rather than money in my purse, I should be winning a greater in place of a lesser gain, and that too in a better part of me. Okay, so one theme we've been seeing throughout is the idea that virtue in the soul is more important than the worldly benefits of things like money or beauty or fame and so on. Also, just a reminder here that the definition that he gave of justice back in the Republic and that he's been implying throughout this whole dialogue is the idea that the three parts of the soul each have their own proper function, and they should each be doing that proper function in the proper order. And so that idea is also here as well, the idea that you don't take what's not yours, that everything is in its own proper place. And that also has to do with the state of mind that he calls justice. And the rule, thou shalt not move the immovable, this was introduced, I think, back in Book 8. It's rightly applicable to many cases, and the case before us is one of them. And people ought also to believe the stories told about these matters, how that such conduct is injurious to the getting of children. On the surface, it really doesn't make sense. Why would stealing from someone else be injurious to the getting of children? But if you look at that analogy underneath and what each thing is representing, here we're representing the idea of injustice in the soul and the getting of children. Throughout, we've been seeing this idea of children being analogous to insights. And so, well, it doesn't make sense to say that stealing from a stranger or from a neighbor is going to be injurious to the getting of children. It makes perfect sense to say that a lack of justice in the soul is injurious to the getting of insights. And so I think that's what he's really getting at here. Okay, now he's going to go on to talk about something he's going to call retail trade. And again, we need to ask ourselves, what's he really talking about? Okay, the natural purpose for which all retail trading comes into existence in a state is not loss, but precisely the opposite. For how can anyone be anything but a benefactor if he renders even and symmetrical the distribution of any kind of goods which before was unsymmetrical and uneven? Okay, throughout all of Plato's works, we see the idea of symmetry and evenness being applied to the idea of a healthy soul. So we already can see that whatever he means by retail trade, it's something that benefits the soul and makes it healthier. My dear Clinias, small is the class of men, rare by nature and trained too with the superlative training, who, when they fall into divers needs and lusts, are able to stand out firmly for moderation, and who, when they have the power of taking much wealth, are sober and choose what is of due measure rather than what is large. So this idea of moderation comes up again here, and we see the idea that when you are alone in your house, for example, or you're just like turning inward, thinking about Plato's dialogues or any other deep thoughts that you have, whatever your personal questions are, when you're contemplating those questions or you're thinking, What is virtue? I want to turn it inward, not just as a theoretical concept, but I want to really internalize it and see what state of mind it brings me to. It's relatively easy. I won't say it's easy, but it's relatively easy to do that in the privacy of your thoughts when you're by yourself. But when you're out in the world and you're dealing with people who don't care about these things at all, who are caught up in a very different state of mind, different way of seeing the world, it becomes much harder to hold on to these ideas. Like if any of you have ever read Buddhist literature, there are many stories I'm sure you've seen where a monk is told by the head teacher, you have to go out in the world. You've had some insights, that's great. Now you have to leave, because that's another stage in the growth of the soul. And Platonism has that as well. In the allegory of the cave, once we've seen the upper world, once we've left the cave and seen the world of sunshine and seen that upper world, then the next stage of growth is to go back down into the cave and to try to adjust to the darkness. And he says that once you can adjust to it, you will see 10,000 times better than anyone else in the cave, than other people in the cave. And so that's another stage of growth. And that's what I think is meant here by retail trade, the idea of being out in the world, dealing with the public. It is a stage of our growth. And to be able to hold on to that wiser state of mind, that sober, moderate, temperate state of mind, even when you're back in the world, that's the real challenge. So he goes on to say that the disposition of the mass of people is exactly the opposite of what he described before, the idea of holding on to that moderation. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. When they desire without limit. And when they can make moderate gains, they prefer to gain insatiably. And it is because of this that all the classes concerned with retail trade, commerce, and innkeeping, so other jobs dealing with the public, they're all disparaged and subjected to violent abuse. Now, if anyone were to do what never will be done, heaven forbid, but I shall make the supposition, ridiculous though it is, namely, compel the best men everywhere for a certain period to keep inns, or to peddle, or to carry on any such trade, or even to compel women by some necessity of fate to take part in such a mode of life, then we should learn how that each of these callings is actually friendly and desirable. We have to go back down into the cave. That's part of our growth. So it's actually friendly and desirable. And if all of these callings were carried on according to a rule free from corruption, they would be honored with the honor which one pays to a mother or a nurse. Well, what honor is that? It's the honor you give to somebody who loves you and cares for you and is nurturing you and helping you grow. And that's what this retail trade is doing, because it's that stage of our growth where we're continuing our education. But as things are now, whenever a person has planted his house firmly with a view to retail trade, in a desert place and with all the roads to it lengthy, if in this welcome lodging he receives travelers in distress, providing tranquility and calm to those buffeted by fair storms or restful coolness after torrid heat, the next thing is that instead of treating them as comrades and providing friendly gifts as well as entertainment, he holds them in ransom, as if they were captive foemen in his hands, demanding very high sums of unjust and unclean ransom money. It is criminal practices such as this, in the case of all these trades, that afford grounds for complaint against this way of succoring distress. Now, I think what he's describing here are people who go back down into the cave, who want or go out into the world, is what they really mean, and they've had some insights, but instead of continuing, of seeing this as a stage of their education, they see themselves as now they're ready to make some money. Now they've got these insights and they're ready to become teachers who charge high prices, and like the sophist of his day. And even in, today we have our parallels to this idea. And so these people are the ones who give philosophy and wisdom traditions a bad name. For these evils, then, the lawgiver must in each case provide a medicine. It is an old and true saying that it is hard to fight against the attack of two foes from opposite quarters, as in the case of diseases and many other things. And indeed, our present fight in this matter is against two foes, poverty and plenty, of which the one corrupts the soul of men with luxury, while the other, by means of pain, plunges it into shamelessness. And so he asks, what remedy then is to be found for this disease in a state gifted with understanding? Well, the first is to employ the trading class as little as possible. The second, to assign to that class those people whose corruption would prove no great loss to the state. And the third is to find a means whereby the dispositions of those engaged in these callings may not quite so easily become infected by shamelessness and meanness of soul. Now, to explain what he means here, because he needs to open it up for us, he's going to give us 3 laws. What I want to do is present all 3, and then I will talk a little bit about how to put them together. So let our law in these matters run in this wise. Here's the first law. None of all the landowners who belong to the 5,040 houses shall either willingly or unwillingly become a retail trader or a merchant, or engage in any menial service for private persons who do not make an equal return to himself. So remember, the 5,040 houses represents the healthy soul, and it has to always be that number then. We never take away, we never add to it. And now comes the second law. Whosoever intends to engage in retail trade must be a resident alien or a foreigner. And then the third law. In order that such a one may be as good as possible, or as little as possible bad, he being a resident in our state, the law wardens must bear in mind that they are guardians not only of those who, being well trained both by birth and nurture, are easy to guard from lawless and evil ways, but also of those who are otherwise, and who follow pursuits which greatly tend to urge them on the road to vice. And these they must guard the more. Okay, so we want to put these 3 laws together. We don't want anyone from the 5,040 to be the ones who go into retail trade. Instead, we're sending foreigners or resident aliens. And then this idea of guarding more closely, especially those who are maybe less wise or haven't yet fully integrated the teachings yet. Here, the guarding must be even more diligent. What I see when I put all this together is a further insight into what really happens when we go down into the cave. This was hard, perhaps, for Plato to show with the analogy in the cave because, of course, we're looking at states of mind as in the cave allegory when we're talking about loosening our chains and standing up and looking around the cave, and then the whole journey out of the cave and the whole experience of adjusting to the sunlight. That's another whole section of the allegory. And so all of this is about states of mind. And so even though it's the body that's moving, it's actually states of mind. And so when we go back down into the cave, it's perfectly natural to assume that the state of mind is also going back down into the cave. However, what he's showing us here is that's not quite accurate. And so it's like he's tweaking what is there in the allegory of the cave. It was hard with that imagery to make this further point. But now he can make this point that physically we're going back down, and obviously we're relating to people and we want to be in the moment relating to them. But our state of mind must always be in the upper world. And that's why the 5,040 people houses are not the ones who go down. Because our state of mind must actually stay, that purest part of us, that wisest part of us, must stay in the upper world, in the sense that we have to be holding on to those insights that we had in the upper world when we are functioning in the world at large. And so that's really what he's talking about here. That it's when he's depicting it in this analogy as like the resident aliens being the one who go down, as opposed to the 5040. And then he's further adding to it that we have to really be on guard, that we have to be vigilant and watch our state of mind, because it's so easy, if you haven't yet worked through some of your attraction to worldly values, it's easy to get sucked back into them when you're back in that environment. And so that's why many people, even if they had the best of intentions when they first went back into the world, they find themselves getting sucked into this world and starting to think about, oh, how many likes can I get? Or how many, followers do I get? Or how much money can I make? How famous can I be? Do I have the reputation of a wise person? And so all these sort of temptations can grab us. And so we have to be extra vigilant. Okay, next he goes on to talk about military security, which throughout has always been related to the idea of courage and really going back into the cave or going into retail trade, either imagery you want to go with. That also is very much involved with the idea of courage, of avoiding those temptations and not giving into fears of, like, say, being unpopular or standing out as the weird one or whatever. So those are the various fears people feel. I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice. And so he's going to go on with this idea of the state of mind of courage with military security. It is right to allude in passing to those whose craft is military security. That is to say, military commanders and all experts in such matters. Okay, so that's our transition. He says, first in merit come those on whom the greatest reward must be bestowed, namely those who have proved themselves able preeminently to honor the written code of the good lawgivers. That's the real mark of courage. It's one thing to talk the talk, quite another to walk the walk. And so that's what he's really talking about here. And he says, most of us are more or less in a dull and enfeebled state of mind when we imagine that we are nearly at the point of death. What do you mean by this, stranger? A man at the point of death, Clinias, is a difficult subject, and overflowing with speech that is most alarming and vexatious to a lawgiver. So one theme that we've seen throughout is the idea that we want to educate our soul in those sober periods of our life, but not when there's a lot of stress or a lot of terrible things going on in our life, when we are feeling like a lot of people, maybe when someone in their family is dying, they'll find themselves praying to God for the first time. And that way of coming to God, it's perfectly valid, of course, but the real growth comes in those periods when we have we're more or less at a stable place in our life. Maybe that's also part of the initial purging, the initial purification process, is bringing ourselves to a state where there's less drama in our world. And that's the time when we're most open to this kind of growth, because this education of the soul really requires sober reflection, and it takes time. I mean, theoretically, just a snap of the finger to, jump to that higher state of mind, to have insight. Insight doesn't require time, but it does take time to internalize it and to go through that transformative benefit that all of this education is meant to bring us. And so it's not at the point of death. If you're waiting until you're on your deathbed hoping that a priest will give you absolution, you're not a Platonist. So that's what he's talking about here. Oh, friends, we will say, for you who are literally but creatures of a day, it is hard at present to know your own possessions, and, as the Pythian oracle declares, your own selves to boot. That's to know thyself. So I, as lawgiver, make this ruling, that both you yourself and this your property are not your own, but belong to the whole of your race, both past and future, and that still more truly does all your race and its property, belong to the state. And so now Plato is challenging us to mature our state of mind even further, and to open ourselves to the possibility that the individual soul is part of a greater whole, like a world soul, that it's not ours alone, that this idea of individuality is something we have to question. And this is more than just a conceptual insight. It's one that we have to turn inward and sit with it and think about it and challenge whatever objections we have to it, because this is what is necessary to further mature our souls. Okay, now he's going to talk about children, and of course, throughout all of his dialogues, children represent insights. So the guardian shall fare first the gods above, who pay regard to the solitude of orphans, and secondly the souls of the dead, whose natural instinct it is to care especially for their own offspring, and to be kindly disposed to those who respect them, and hostile to those who disrespect them. And thirdly, they shall fear the souls of the living, who are old and who are held in high esteem. Since where the state flourishes under good laws, their children's children revere the aged with affection and live in happiness. And so here we see 3 levels of states of mind, 3 metaphysical levels. And also we see this idea of orphans being introduced. And I'm going to leave this one to you to think about. But of course, if all children represent insights, then orphans are children whose parents are no longer living. So you want to think about, what do they represent and how is it used? See, the gods above pay regard to the solitude of orphans, and see how orphans are discussed throughout this section. When an orphan has received full age, if he thinks that he has been badly cared for, he shall be allowed to bring an action concerning the guardianship within a period of 5 years after the date of its expiration. And if the guardian lose his case, the court shall assess the amount of his penalty or fine. And if it be a magistrate that is held to have injured the orphan by neglect, the court shall assess what sum he shall pay to the child. But if the injury be due to unjust dealing, in addition to the fine, he shall be removed from his office of law warden, and the public authority of the state shall appoint another in his place to act as law warden for the country and the state. So the orphans have a right to be cared for where they're expected to be cared for, and if they're not cared for, then there is a penalty to be paid. Now he goes on from orphans to talk about one's own children. Now, whereas under another polity, a son, when disinherited, would not necessarily cease to be a citizen, but it is necessary in our state, of which these are to be the laws, that this now fatherless man, the son who was disinherited, he should emigrate to another state, since it is impossible that a single household should be added to our 5040. Consequently, it is necessary that the person upon whom this punishment is to be inflicted legally should be disinherited, not by his father only, but by the whole family. Sounds rather harsh on the surface, but of course, if we know that children are our insights, then to disinherit an insight, or to disinherit a son, is to throw out an insight, and so of course it has to be thrown out completely. But such cases should be dealt with according to a law such as this. If anyone is urged by a most unhappy impulse of anger to desire, rightly or wrongly, to expel from his own kindred one whom he has begotten and reared, he shall not be permitted to do this informally and immediately, but he shall, first of all, assemble his own kinsfolk as far as cousins, and likewise his son's kinfolk on the mother's side. And in the presence of these he shall accuse his son, showing how he deserves at the hands of all to be expelled from the family. And he shall grant to the son an equal length of time for arguing that he does not deserve to suffer any such treatment. So if we want to throw out one of our insights, we don't want to do it in just a knee-jerk sort of fashion. We want to deeply consider it from all sides. We want to sit down, perhaps in a dialectic, looking at what it is, how it functions, looking at every aspect of this particular insight, think of the pros and cons of it, look at it from all sides. We don't want to be hasty. Okay, now a few words about divorce and widowhood. I have a quote of each. First, about divorce. He says that if a man and his wife, being of unhappy dispositions, in no wise agree together, it is right that they should be under the constant control of 10 members of the Board of Law Wardens, of middle age, together with 10 of the women in charge of marriage, because of course they should. If these officials are able to bring about a reconciliation, this arrangement shall hold good. But if their passions rage too high for harmony, the officials shall, so far as possible, seek out other suitable unions for each of them. And I think harmony is really the key word here. So marriage often is used to represent the union or harmony of the soul. And we've seen with the idea of temperance that it's about a union and harmony within the three parts of the soul. And that's why the desires would naturally fall in line with what is wise. When you have that union, when you have that harmony, then you have a temperate soul. But if you lack that harmony, you lack temperance. And so that's really what is going on here. And now, as for widowhood, if a man's wife dies, leaving both male and female children, there shall be a law, advisory rather than compulsory, directing the husband to rear the children without introducing a stepmother, so keeping a certain purity, not bringing anyone else in. But if there be no children, the widower must of necessity marry, until he has begotten children sufficient alike for his household and the state. Because, of course, begetting children means having insights, and that is our goal, or one of our goals. Honoring the gods. The ancient laws of men concerning the gods are twofold. Some of the gods whom we honor we see clearly, but of others we set up statues as images. And we believe that when we worship these, lifeless though they be, the living gods beyond feel great goodwill towards us and gratitude. The idea of worshiping or praying to statues is something that we see quite a bit in the later Platonists, especially for perhaps Iamblichus, a little bit in Plotinus as well, and some others. Here we see that Plato also recognized some validity to this. Now, we don't know enough about Plato's private life to know if he personally ever set up statues as images that he worshipped, but we can see here that he saw it as something valid. The basic metaphysics behind it is the idea that this physical realm is the receiver of reason principles from nature and from the realm of soul. And so the idea being that it is possible for a statue to be a proper receptacle in a way for soul. He makes a point of saying that the soul is still lifeless. So soul doesn't give it life, but it gives it a certain vibration perhaps that makes it a conduit between us and the divine. We have not as yet dealt with any of the minor cases in which willful and deliberate injury is caused by means of potions, foods, and unguents. A division in our treatment of poisoning cases is required by the fact that following the nature of mankind, they are of two distinct types. The type that we have now expressly mentioned is that in which injury is done to bodies by bodies according to nature's laws. Distinct from this is the type which, by means of sorceries and incantations and spells, as they are called, not only convinces those who attempt to cause injury that they really can do so, but convinces also their victims that they certainly are being injured by those who possess the power of bewitchment. Now, we've seen earlier this idea of bewitchment as being that spell of sorts that we're put under by pleasures or pains. So two distinct kinds of injuries, the physical kind and the kind that injures the soul. Now everyone shall pay the penalty which is attached to his crime by way of correction. The penalty, I cannot speak today, I'm so sorry. Hold on a second. The penalty shall be lighter in the case of one who has done wrong owing to another's folly, the wrongdoer being over-persuaded because of his youth or for some such reason. And it shall be heavier when the person has done wrong owing to his own folly, because of his incontinence in respect of pleasures and pains and the overpowering influence of craven fears or of incurable desires, envies, and rages. Okay, one additional thing I want to add here is the idea that throughout Plato's dialogues we see this theme that being penalized, if it is just, is something beneficial to the soul, and so therefore it is a good thing. He shall pay the penalty not because of the wrongdoing, for what is done can never be undone, but in order that for the future both he himself and those who behold his punishment may either utterly loathe his sin or at least renounce to a great extent such lamentable conduct. So the idea of getting benefit for the soul. And then the last section that I want to look at is what he's calling here madness. Now, in some other dialogues, he presents madness in a positive light. In the Phaedrus, for example, there's a beautiful section, rather poetical, talking about divine madness as the madness of the wise. But here we're going to see it presented in a less favorable light. There are many and various forms of madness. In the case now mentioned, it is caused by disease, but cases also occur where it is due to the natural growth and fostering of an evil temper, by which people in the course of a trifling quarrel abuse one another slanderously with loud cries, a thing which is unseemly and totally out of place in a well-regulated state. We've seen in other places as well that Plato was very critical of people who lash out with self-righteous indignation or in this prideful sort of way. And that's what he's focusing on here and in the next one as well. From those light things, words, there spring indeed things most heavy to bear, even hatreds and feuds, when people begin by cursing one another and foully abusing one another in the manner of fishwives. And the person who utters such words is gratifying a thing most ungracious and sating his passion with foul foods. And by thus brutalizing afresh that part of his soul which once was humanized by education, he makes a wild beast of himself through his rancorous life, and wins only gall for gratitude from his passion. In such disputes, all people are commonly wont to proceed to indulge in ridicule of their opponent. But everyone who has ever yet indulged in this practice has either failed to achieve a virtuous disposition, or else has lost in great measure his former high-mindedness. And so we see here that, again, he is not at all favorable of simply lashing out. It's not because you just care so much. Don't give him that excuse that you just feel a lot, and that's why. He's saying here that if you act that way, it means either you never really reached a state of wisdom or you lost that state. It slipped away from you. Although there are many fair things in human life, yet to most of them there clings a kind of canker which poisons and corrupts them. None would deny that justice between people is a fair thing, and that it has civilized all human affairs. And if justice be fair, how can we deny that pleading is also a fair thing? So on the surface, discussion should always be welcome. But of course, we all know people who maybe say the most unreasonable things in a reasonable tone of voice and then say, why can't we just discuss this? Why are you resisting this conversation? And so there are wrong ways to go about discussion, and that's what we're going to look at next here. That these fair things are in disrepute owing to a kind of foul art, which, cloaking itself under a fair name, claims first that there exists a device for dealing with lawsuits, and further that it is the one which is able, by pleading and helping another to plead, to win the victory, whether the pleas concerned be just or unjust. And it also asserts that both this art itself and the arguments which proceed from it are a gift offered to anyone who gives money in exchange. So I think you see where he's going. This art, whether it be really an art or merely an artless trick got by habit and practice, must never, if possible, arise in our state. And so it sounds very much there like what he's talking about there is sophistry, and the art that he's talking about, the foul art that is a device, would be rhetoric. In the dialogue Gorgias, he looks there at whether or not rhetoric is actually an art, and you can probably guess the answer. But that's where we're going to end it today. So that gives us a little bit of the state of mind of one who has gone through this education. And then next week, I'm going to wrap it all up with book 12. So I do hope you'll join me then. And as always, if you like what you're seeing, I would appreciate a thumbs up. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them below. Thank you. Hope you'll join me next week.